Hello, this is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I am joined by Keith Preston, and we're going to discuss anarchism. And now, Keith, I sent you a kind of springboard or conversation starter from an individual named Jay Dyer. It was titled Anarchism as a Dialectical Subversion Tool. Now, I've read this before, and one of the things that I find interesting about this is that just Jay Dyer seems to think that anarchism is innately atheistic, and that if he can discredit atheistic materialism, he's discredited anarchism. Now, what's interesting is many anarchists themselves believe anarchism is innately atheistic. But if you look at the origins of anarchism, it actually begins in Christianity. In the English Civil War, the first anarchists were the Duggars by Gerard Winstanley. And we still have anarchist Christians today. We have Leo Tolstoy from the 19th century, and his followers still exist, by the way. So I find it somewhat interesting that both anarchist proponents and anarchist critics tend to pigeonhole it as a kind of materialist philosophy, which there is that element. I won't deny that historically. But historically, it's a little more complicated than that. So what do you have to say?
Well, the historical relationship between anarchism and religion has been somewhat schizophrenic in the sense that what you find on one hand anarchists, certainly many anarchists who were very militant in their anti-clerical views to the point of things like in the Spanish Revolution, they burned churches and stuff like that. On the other hand, like you were saying, there are traditions within anarchism that have their inspiration in religious traditions of some kind. Christian anarchism in particular is a major tradition within anarchism. Now, there are some other atheist anarchists who try to write that out, just like they try to write out other things. I mean, anarchists are famous for trying to write each other out of the movement or tradition, but there's certainly a very strong Christian anarchist tradition that is associated first with Tolstoy. He's probably the most famous Christian anarchist writers. However, as you mentioned, there were anarchist movements or proto-anarchist movements that are much older than Tolstoy, that go all the way back to the 17th century, perhaps even earlier, that had a kind of proto-anarchist outlook. And there were a variety of other movements that have come since that time. In the 19th century, there were American anarchist movements with a Christian orientation, though there were radical Christian sects that had a type of anarchist outlook or something very similar. The Catholic Worker Organization is a Christian anarchist organization. It was specifically anarchist and specifically Christian, and actually loyal to the papacy at the same time. So you do have this kind of paradox within anarchist history in terms of this kind of schizophrenic relationship between religion and anarchism. You can find some really virulent anti-religious writings among anarchists, including a lot of well-known historic anarchists. Bakunin was one, Johann Most was one. But then you also find, like I said, these other Christian anarchist traditions. You also find religious anarchist traditions that draw on other religious traditions, Islam and Buddhism and some others as well. Although certainly none of those are quite the major tradition in anarchism that the Christian anarchist tradition is.
Yeah. Another more maybe well-known non-Christian anarchist theist was Hakim Bey. I don't know a lot about him, but you a couple of years ago interviewed an anarchist who was kind of a follower of Hakim Bey. Do you have any interesting things to say about that?
Hakim Bey, I don't know much about his views on religion and spirituality. I know he was somewhat influenced by Eastern religious traditions, but I don't really know in what way or to what degree. He was more well known for his concept of what's called permanent autonomous zones, which is the idea of, forming cultural enterprises or social institutions independently of the state. It's kind of like the idea of forming alternative infrastructure. It's just like a commune or something like that. That was just a fancy term for it. Hakim Bey is an extremely controversial figure in anarchist circles, in part because he was also interested in pederasty. That it sort of gives him a black mark in a lot of circles. But within the anarchist tradition, it's important to recognize that proto-anarchist movements and ideas are much older than the actual anarchist movement that developed in the 18th and 19th century with thinkers like Godwin and Proudhon and Bakunin and some of that. And one of the best books I know of on this topic is Demanding the Impossible by Peter Marshall. It's like an 800 pages plus work on the history of anarchism. And I think it's a serious effort to do the philosophy justice, not only because the author sympathizes with anarchism, but because he really is trying to go back and identify proto-anarchist movements from antiquity, from ancient Chinese philosophy, from the throughout the history of Christianity, from the Middle Ages, from some of the movements you mentioned, the Diggers and the Levelers and all of that. And the anarchist tradition really only assumes the kind of militant anti-clerical perspective that you're thinking about in the 19th century. And even then, that was only a strand within it. I mean, it was an important, an influential strand, but only a strand.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the anti-clerical strand is typically what people think of, but I think that the religious strain is just as potent with people like Leo Tolstoy and Dorothy Day.
Well, one thing that needs to be clarified is that in the places where the classical anarchist movements developed, one of the motivating factors behind the extreme anti-clericalism had to do with the relationship between the church and the state. Like anarchist movements of the kind that developed in America and England, even in Germany, didn't quite have that kind of extreme anti-clerical strand that you found in Spain or in Russia or in the places where the church really was a reactionary force that was usually aligned with an oppressive autocratic government. It was in those places that the militant anti-clericalism tended to develop. It would be, let's say, for example, that if anarchist movements were to start developing in the Islamic world today, in the countries that are predominantly Muslim, well, a comparable phenomena would be, let's say, if you had anarchist movements that developed in Saudi Arabia that were extremely anti-clerical, whereas in Lebanon or in Syria, perhaps not, in Muslim countries where the power of religion is not really intertwined with the state in quite the same kind of way. That explains a lot of how that evolved in the way that it did.
It's interesting. You mentioned the fact that where religion was particularly reactionary, it led to this anti-clericalism. But in many ways, Russia is kind of unique. The Russian nihilists, which were prototypical anarchists of a kind, one of their leading lights was Dmitry Karkazov, and he named the inner group of his anarchist cabal Hell. But at the same time, you also had Leo Tolstoy, a very almost mystical man. And so in Russia, you had the two anarchist contradictions, a deeply anti-clerical anarchism and a deeply mystical religious anarchism, both arising from a reactionary religious background.
Well, movements reflect the cultural environment in which they evolve in, and the Russian Orthodox Church, even though it was heavily intertwined with the state, also is the Orthodox tradition does have a mystical dimension to it in a way that some other branches of Christianity do not. And just like in North America, some of the types of Christian anarchism that developed in North America obviously had a kind of radical Protestant strand to them as well, because America is a nation that's always had a lot of radical Protestants. And it also had the Catholic, Dorothy Day was a Catholic, so they also had that strand as well. But it is interesting how even anarchist movements reflect the cultural environment they emerge out of. And I think that explains, on one hand, why in Russia you'd have someone like Tolstoy. On the other hand, you'd have something like these nihilists that were into, bombing churches or assassinating priests and things like that. While we're on that subject, another interesting dichotomy that you find in anarchist history is this dichotomy between extreme pacifists on one hand and terrorists and on the other hand. You'll find people like Tolstoy, like Dorothy Day, and there are others too, and not just religious pacifists, but even secular pacifists who were staunch believers in the ethos of nonviolence and things of that nature. They might advocate civil disobedience or something like that at times, but they don't necessarily advocate, insurrection or terrorism. And there are some anarchist pacifists who take that in a pretty radical direction. You also have other anarchists historically that have engaged in terrorism, almost at random, almost just random violence, almost like these public shooters that we have today. They were probably more comparable to some of the kind of Islamic terrorism that you see today. In fact, there was the British writer Johann Hari. He's a leftist. He actually went and interviewed some young men who were Muslim, radical Muslims who sympathize with Muslim terrorist organizations. And then he read them the writings of some old anarchist terrorist writers from the early 20th century, late 19th century, and says, "What do you think of this stuff?" And these radical Muslims were like, "Yeah, this is us, they sound just like us." So you do have that kind of extreme dichotomy within anarchism between, advocacy of violence to the point of being sociopathic on one hand, and extremely idealistic pacifism on the other hand. Just like you have the religious and anti-religious dichotomy, you have the collectivist and individualist dichotomy, you have the futuristic, technologically oriented theories of anarchism, and then you've got let's go back to primitive societies version. All of those dichotomies are there.
Yeah. What would you say of? You mentioned the more pacifistic tendency within anarchism versus the more terroristic tendency. Now, it seems to me from a cursory reading of history, though you're right, it's not a complete overlap, that it's the religious strands like Tolstoy and Dorothy Day that tend to be more pacifist-oriented. And it seems to be more the more secular humanist types. I'm thinking specifically of the illegalists and the followers of Max Stirner and the Russian nihilists that tend to be more violent and terroristic. Does that interpretation ring true to you?
Well, certainly in terms of the most well-known examples, I think that's true, in the sense that the anarcho-terrorists, or whatever you want to call them, also tended to be very anti-clerical for the most part. You also, and then the most well-known examples of pacifist anarchism, like Dorothy Day and Tolstoy, tended to be more religiously oriented. There are lesser-known individuals in anarchist history that do not necessarily fit into that dichotomy. You did have anarchist or quasi-anarchist movements in particularly parts of what we now call the Third World, that might have had a religious, or at least a pseudo-religious orientation, but were also violent, or at least into armed struggle or something like that. And then you also have people who are not particularly religious in terms of any kind of orientation, but do advocate a type of pacifism as a type of secular ideal. I don't know that A.J. Muste ever claimed to be an anarchist. I think he was a socialist, but A.J. Muste was somewhat in that tradition of a secular humanist pacifist, if you will, or there are others that fall into that category. So it's not quite an extreme polarization as it is in terms of the most well-known examples, but there are a lot of outliers in that.
Yeah, that's true. To double back a little bit, you mentioned anarchists writing other anarchists out of history. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is a kind of a contemporary struggle about the history of anarchism is a lot of anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists will say that, oh, you anarcho-capitalists aren't really anarchists because you're, heaven forbid, individualists. But doesn't the likes of, say, Max Stirner, the German egoist, and American individualist anarchism with the likes of, say, Josiah Warren and Henry David Thoreau kind of indicate that anarcho-capitalism might have a pedigree within the anarchist tradition?
Well, that's a complicated question as well, and you're right in the sense that there are a lot of anarcho-communists as well as anarcho-capitalists who refuse to recognize each other as legitimate branches of anarchism. You can go on Facebook and find all kinds of social media groups where this argument goes on back and forth among anarchists. You'll find a post that with 1,000, a thread with 1,000 posts where they're discussing this. There seem to be whole Facebook groups that are devoted to nothing else but debating this topic. But the debate has always been there. In the debate that we see today between anarcho-capitalist and between anarcho-communist and all the other related or overlapping philosophies was just as present in the 19th century as it is now. In the 19th century, for example, you had the American individualist anarchists like Benjamin R. Tucker was the most well-known representative of that philosophy. And you also had anarcho-communists like Johann Most. He was a German immigrant to the United States. And these two gentlemen, I remember reading once about a conference that was being held in the 19th century. It was an effort to create a unified front among anarchists. And both Johann Most and Benjamin Tucker were invited to this, and neither one of them would actually show up because they didn't recognize the other one as being a true anarchist. And that kind of thing continues to happen. Now, today, ironically, you have people who you have anarchists of the left, anarchists who identify with the socialist tradition, who will accept individualist anarchism as a legitimate branch of anarchism, but not anarcho-capitalism, not the Rothbard philosophy. They'll say, okay, Benjamin Tucker, yeah, okay, he was anti-capitalist, he was in the club, but no, not this Rothbard stuff, or not this stuff that's influenced by the Friedmans or Ayn Rand or any of that kind of stuff. But the same debate was present in the 19th century. Probably the first thinker to create a modern systematic philosophy of anarchism, although he didn't really call it that, was William Godwin. And Godwin was, and I guess you could say his view was that of an anarcho-communist who wanted to achieve anarcho-communism by laissez-faire means. Like he didn't advocate any kind of state-oriented action for the sake of achieving what we would call anarcho-communism. He thought it could all be done through laissez-faire means. He was sort of a radical liberal for his time. Rothbard actually recognized him as having been a libertarian, and Rothbard was always hesitant to excommunicate those or write out those that didn't share his orientation as well. But both libertarians and anarcho-communists will often claim Godwin as part of their tradition. Stirner, again, it's the same thing with Stirner. I've come across libertarian, individualist anarchists, anarcho-capitalists who claim Stirner as one of their own. I've also come across anarcho-communists who claim Stirner as one of their own, and they always it's kind of like the debate that goes on among fans of Nietzsche. Everybody from Nazis to anarchists and everything in the middle tries to claim Nietzsche for themselves. There are even Marxists or radical feminists who try to claim Nietzsche for themselves. But the debate between the individualist and collectivist tendencies within anarchism has always been there, just like the anti-clerical and the religious tendencies have always been there. And that debate has always has really gone on for centuries now, and it still goes on today. And of course, you've got points of view that are in favor of collectivism, like collectivist anarchism, the type that was developed by Bakunin, and then there's anarcho-communism, and then anarcho-syndicalism, and then on the other end, you've got anarcho-capitalism and an individualist anarchism and egoist anarchism, and of course there are middle of the road points of view like the Georgioism, it's sometimes called, or geo-libertarianism, but the followers of Henry George, and then the mutualists, the followers of Proudhon, and of course those are always trying to the ones that are kind of middle of the road philosophies get criticized by both ends as being too socialistic or too capitalistic or something like that. So none of that is anything new.
Yeah. Would you consider Gustav Molinari an anarchist? I know many anarcho-capitalists wish to claim so.
I think in theory, if not in name, I don't think he ever called himself that. He was sort of a radical classical liberal who took the whole laissez-faire point of view to the degree of advocating no state at all. And it was essentially the same thing that Rothbard did. Rothbard was basically a radical classical liberal who likewise took that to the point of advocating for no state. And then he discovered individualist anarchism and said, well, yeah, okay, I'm an individualist anarchist. But he didn't agree with a lot of Tucker's economic theories, Benjamin Tucker's economic theories. So he sort of took individualist anarchism and sort of created a hybrid of that and the economic ideas you find in Austrianism, like Mises and Friedrich von Hayek and some of those people. So that's really what anarcho-capitalism is. Although it could be reasonably argued that Gustav Molinari, created a theory of anarcho-capitalism before Rothbard.
Yeah. This historical question seems to have some relevance to current disputes between the thick and the thin libertarians. It seems that there's certain famous anarchists of history, I'm thinking primarily of Benjamin Tucker and Kropotkin, had values that ultimately ran cross purposes to anarchism. Because during the First World War, both Kropotkin and Tucker argued that the success of the Enlightenment was imperiled by the evil Hun. Despite the fact that Russia, an ally, was the most reactionary great power of the day, that they had to ally with the Allies, which is a complete revocation of anarchism. And during the American Civil War, the anarcho-pacifist William Lloyd Garrison, who was an abolitionist, allied with Abraham Lincoln. And before he died, it's questionable whether Henry David Thoreau did not ally with Abraham Lincoln. There seems to be a kind of inner contradiction within certain anarchists where they have values that trump anarchism itself, and they're willing to ally with the state to pursue those.
Yeah, and that still happens today as well. And it's a complicated question because most all anarchists have values other than simply being against the state. There's nobody that's an anarchist that says, well, anti-statism is the only value there is. Nothing else matters. No other ethical system, no other economic idea, no other social theory, no other religious value, no other cultural value or whatever. There's probably very few anarchists who say just the state as an abstraction is a bad idea and that's it. So there's always going to be and are anarchists who always debate among themselves about where compromises ought to be made. As for the question of World War I, that was a complicated mess because on one hand you had some anarchists who were zealously opposed to World War I, and particularly in the United States. You had anarchists that were put in jail for opposing World War I, who were deported from the United States for opposing World War I, and similar things happened in Europe as well. But you did have some other anarchists who supported the war effort, who supported the Allied side. You mentioned a couple. Kropotkin, probably as well known a figure in anarchist history as anyone, suddenly became a Russian patriot during World War I. Tucker, who was living in France at the time, France was sort of his adopted country, and he was a French patriot or nationalist or whatever. He supported the French effort in World War I. There were others as well. There was another well-known French anarchist named Sebastian Faure who also supported World War I. So that was an issue among anarchists at the time, and the same thing has happened in more recent times as well. Within the libertarian milieu. Now, the modern American libertarian movement is not the same thing as historic anarchism. There is a distinction there. Certainly has some similar ideas, but there is a distinction in terms of its history and trajectory and all of that. But it's just like among libertarians, there was a debate among libertarians that were in favor of the Iraq War and those who weren't. Those who were in favor of the war in Afghanistan and those who weren't. And you found the same thing when World War I broke out. You found the majority of anarchists during that time were opposed to the war. Some, again, went to jail or whatever, or faced repression for opposing the war, or others refused military service and things like that. But there were some that didn't. There were others, including well-known, very important anarchist figures that did support the war effort. The same thing happened during World War II. There were some anarchists that were opposed to World War II that went to jail rather than support the war. or serve in the military. There were others that didn't. There were some anarchists. In fact, I used to know some elderly anarchists in New York City who were World War II veterans. I mean, they were anarchists at the time, and they went into the American military and served in the American military, and fighting for the Allied cause. And in their own minds, they justified this by saying, we're not fighting for the American capitalist, imperialist, whatever. We're fighting against Hitler, which is fair enough, I suppose. But again, that's war is an extreme example, because war is generally an activity that's carried out between states or by states, and when anarchists come out in favor of a particular war, that's certainly a problematic issue. But you also find anarchists debating among themselves about how to compromise with the state on other issues. I mean, in the Spanish Civil War, there was the issue of should anarchists join the government, join the Republican government or not? And they did. Some of them did, and that's they've been criticized for that ever since.
Kind of your proverbial forbidden fruit.
Yeah, and even in today's world, you have anarchists like Noam Chomsky who say, well, sure, anarchism is a nice ideal. I support that. But in the meantime, we really need state socialism to keep the capitalist corporations at bay. You also have another issue that anarchists argue about among themselves, and that's immigration. You have again, I'm talking mostly about libertarians and anarcho-capitalists at this point, but there's a big debate among libertarians and anarcho-capitalists about whether to advocate open borders between nations or not. And there are interesting theories, and I think compelling arguments from both sides of that point of view can be made. But even among the left socialist type anarchists, even in that circle, there's some differences of opinion on the question of immigration. There are some anarchist groups internationally, particularly some syndicalist-oriented groups, that say that the purpose of immigration is to simply create cheap labor for capital and suppress wages. Of course, there are other anarchists who say no nations, no borders, etc. So that debate exists as well. There's always going to be the question among anarchists among what state functions you should support on a pragmatic basis. Many anarchists favor, certainly those of the left favor, social welfare programs as the least bad alternative to what they see as the evils of capitalism. I knew a Cuban anarchist once. In fact, I knew several Cuban anarchists at one point who had actually been exiled. They'd actually been sent into exile by the communist government of Cuba. But they said, there's some things Castro has done that I want to preserve, like the free schools and the free hospitals and things like that. And of course, there are other people, anarcho-capitalists, who are zealously opposed to the minimum wage. And a lot of debate that goes on now between different schools of anarchism. That's one issue I've noticed that comes up a lot, is that the left now has adopted raising the minimum wage as a big issue of interest, and you have the anarcho-communists, some of them out there zealously promoting raising the minimum wage, and then you have other anarcho-capitalists who say, wait a minute, that's government regulation of business and the market, and they'll and plus they'll throw out some of the standard economic arguments that are used against the minimum wage. So it's interesting how that again, that dichotomy exists as well. Under what circumstances is the state the least bad alternative? Under what circumstances should anarchists support some particular state or some kind of state? And I don't think it's a question that has clear-cut answers. Being an anarchist myself, there are some anarchists who are criticized. There are anarchists nowadays who have expressed support for the regime of President Assad in Syria, or even for Putin in Russia. And on grounds, well, what's the alternative? And if Assad's regime falls, we're not going to get some kind of anarchist utopia. We're going to get ISIS taking over all of Syria and throwing people off buildings and cutting people's heads off, and enslaving women as sex slaves and things like that. So it's a rational argument that can be made there, given the context. There's an anarchist or quasi-anarchist influenced insurgency in Kurdistan, the Kurdish region of that area now, and it's led by the PKK group, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is sort of it's a former Marxist party that sort of converted to a quasi-anarchist philosophy, a Murray Bookchin type libertarian socialism over time. And they've actually achieved some actual military victories against ISIS. They've created some independent enclaves for themselves, and but I've seen them criticized for selling oil to the United States. They say, "Well, what are they doing, aligning themselves with the American imperialists?" And I've raised a question when that debate comes up: well, what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to survive financially, economically? If they have oil, it's their leading export product. They've got to sell it. They've got to survive.
You mentioned anarchist military success. Now, there aren't too many examples of violent military anarchist rebellions, but three come to mind. Zapata in Mexico, Nestor Makhno in the Russian Civil War, and I think his name is Durinti in the Spanish Civil War.
Durruti, yeah.
Durruti, yeah. I think, without a doubt, the most successful anarchist military leader was Makhno. Makhno's black Cossacks were some of the most fearsome. I mean, both the whites and the reds respected the blacks. They were not to be trifled with, even though they ultimately were defeated by Lenin. Another issue is, I find it interesting and also worrisome that many left anarchists tend to place equality above their anarchist principles and ally with Marxists, often to their own detriment, as it happened in Russia, where Makhno was forced to flee, I think, to Romania. And then in Spain, where the Stalinist Republic sent in tanks to Barcelona. It's almost like, didn't you see this coming? Well,
that debate has been there as long as modern anarchist movements have existed as well, and it goes all the way back to the time of Marx himself. Some of Marx's early writings were actually polemics against some of his other intellectual rivals, many of whom were the early anarchists. There's a well-known work by Marx called The Poverty of Philosophy, which is basically just a polemic against Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon himself had a book called The Philosophy of Poverty, and Marx attacks Proudhon extensively in this work, The Poverty of Philosophy. One of Marx's works is called The German Ideology, and much of that is a polemic against Max Stirner. Of course, the rivalry between Marx and Bakunin is also well known, and Bakunin was one of the early critics of Marxism, saying, well, there's no such thing as a worker state per se. That he was arguing that the kind of system that the Marxists were advocating would be a repeat of what happened in the French Revolution with the Jacobins, where it was just a new dictatorship that ruled tyrannically, just like whatever it was it replaced. And I think Bakunin his arguments have been borne out by subsequent historical experience. And just about every country where there was a Marxist revolution, the anarchists were subject to as much repression as anybody else was, sometimes more. And now you can also argue, there are Marxists who argue, well, that's not true Marxism. There's a distinction does need to be made between Bolshevism and other types of Marxism. What's called left Marxism, or what Lenin called the infantile disorder. When he said that, he was referring to left Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg, council communists, and so-called libertarian socialists, and guild socialists, and people like that. So there are different types of Marxists. There are Marxists who are really no different than social democrats in actual practice. But that issue, that the conflict between Marxists and anarchists, has been there as long as modern anarchist movements, as long as Marxist movements have existed, going all the way back to the actual individuals who founded those movements. And the same thing exists on the right as well. There's a big debate among right-wing anarchists or anarcho-capitalists or whatever about supporting conservative political parties or conservative business-friendly states. You can find examples among anarcho-capitalists and right libertarians of people claiming that Singapore is some sort of model libertarian society. Even though it's actually a fascist country. I mean, for real. I'm not saying that lightly. Their party that's ruled since the late 1950s is the People's Action Party, which was modeled on Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. In fact, the logo of the ruling party in Singapore is sort of a reworking of the logo of the British Union of Fascists. I mean, and the founder of that party, the late Lee Kuan Yew, was actually had spent time in England and was actually a big admirer of the British Union of Fascists. So Singapore really is a fascist country, but they're widely admired by a lot of free market libertarian types, including supposed anarcho-capitalists because of their supposed business friendly orientation, which I think is a bit bizarre because they actually have extremely high import taxes. They're very protectionist in terms of their economic policies, and they have socialized medicine and all of that corporate welfare and all of that kind of stuff. If anything, Singapore's economy is more like the kind of national capitalism you find in Asia, like in South Korea and Japan and places like that. So I'm not sure why libertarians would find anything to admire in that system, but that they do, I guess, because of their business friendliness. There are other libertarians, anarcho-capitalists who are heavily influenced by the neo-reactionary movement, or who predate that, who were influenced by some of the old style traditional royalist thinkers or apologists, kind of like Erich von Kuehnert-Leddihn or something like that. And some of those will actually point to countries like some of the royal regimes in the Middle East. I've actually had conversations with anarcho-capitalists, very conservative leaning, or I won't say conservative, very right-wing leaning anarcho-capitalists. Will say, well, the system they have in Kuwait, the system they have in Dubai, that's really not that bad. Because they say there's a stability there. It's the argument that Hans Hermann Hoppe outlines in Democracy, the God That Fails. So you see that among both types of anarchists, among anarcho-communists and anarcho-capitalists as well. You see this effort to this effort to sort of adopt some sort of statist regime or movement as somehow a kindred spirit, which I tend to think is a mistake. I tend to be opposed to all of those kinds of ideas. It's one thing to say, well, this particular state in this particular circumstance is the lesser of the two evils. If Assad falls, then what's going to happen? ISIS is going to take over, or during the Cold War, maybe Western democracy was preferable to Stalinism, or and World War II, maybe Western liberalism was preferable to Nazism. Those are eminently reasonable arguments. But when you start actually aligning anarchism with some sort of state-centric movement or statist regimes, I think that's obviously much more problematic.
Yeah, that seems to have been a persistent problem. But one of the things that I think historically need anarchists, at least on the left, probably on the right as well, but right-wing anarchism has not had too many historical examples. Left-wing anarchism has had more historical examples, like Ukraine and Spain and Mexico. And you once mentioned to me that some of the Spanish anarchists were the William Cayley, and William Cayley was the American officer who was guilty of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, were the William Cayleys of the anarchist movement. And I think a lot of left-wing anarchist polemics or apologetics are that, we're just the innocent victims, we're the true good guys because we fought imperialism, we fought Marxism and fascism. But a classic example would be Nestor Makhno. Nestor Makhno was quite vicious. Many of the Mennonite colonies in the Ukraine were terrorized by the blacks. There were massacres at Eichenfeld, Blumenort, and Chortitza. And the Jews also were similarly mistreated in black pogroms. And you can find those from Jewish sources as well. And in Spain, as you mentioned, anti-clericalism led to attacks on the clergy and churches. In fact, in For Whom the Bell Tolls, there's an account, it's fictional, but it's based on fact, where anarchists come into this village and they find people that they just consider to be collaborators or politically unreliable, and they literally kick them off a cliff. And there's actually a real world analog to that. I forget the name of it at the moment. And I feel like that anarchists need to come to terms with that you have engaged in atrocities. The anarchism as a historical movement has engaged in atrocities. Granted, not to the scale of the Soviet Union or not to Germany or the United States. Fair enough. But they still have blood on their hands, and trying to pretend they don't doesn't really help their cause.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, these kinds of things that you're describing are things that happen whenever there's violent conflict between humans. The one problem that a lot of people have, just ordinary lay people, when it comes to the issue of war, for example, is that they really don't understand what happens during war. Like I had a guy I know who was a combat veteran who was in the Vietnam War. He told me one time, he said, if people knew what really happens in war, they wouldn't be so enthusiastic about it when it happens. But when human beings get into violent conflict, these are the kinds of things that happen. People start throwing people off cliffs. People start committing massacres, and any group of people can do this kind of stuff. You talk about how some of the anarchists deny that any of this ever happened or somehow say it was justified, but that's really the same argument that was used to support William Calley that you mentioned. William Calley, the American Army officer that was behind the massacre at My Lai in Vietnam. There were plenty of Americans when that happened who thought he did the right thing, who thought he was a hero, who thought he was being unjustly persecuted. Even though he was clearly committing atrocities and massacring civilians, and no question about it. In fact, the only reason he stopped was because American forces actually intervened and made him stop. But the idea at the time was, well, no good American soldier would ever do something like that. And you find the same thing among anarchists as well. You find anarchists say, well, there's never any wrongdoing on our side, or there's never any atrocities committing on our side. But yeah, and these examples that you give, where you have anarchist groups that have actually gone to war with other groups, and all the same things happened in war generally, and anarchists have been guilty of that when given the opportunity. Not on the level that states have. Anarchists have never been organized in such a way that they have the kind of power that states have, but anarchists have behaved like mafia organizations or routine criminals at times.
Yeah, it's almost like anarchists need their own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just kind of come to terms with the skeletons in the closet. But this is kind of a question. Given the historical record, on average, which anarchist wing would be more likely to compromise with the state? The anarchist left or the anarchist right? Is a historical precedent.
I think it depends on the group and the individual. I don't know that there's anything inherent to either philosophy that would by itself lend itself to that kind of compromise. Rather, I think they would compromise perhaps in different ways. A good example is what we see going on even today. There are anarchists of the right out there who are now supporting Donald Trump. In fact, there's a group called Libertarians for Trump. It's it was founded by an anarcho-capitalist, a very well-known and prominent veteran anarcho-capitalist named Walter Block. I'm not making any judgments about that particular group, but I'm just saying that that's a situation where you find anarchists of the right who are supporting a statist politician that on the grounds he's lesser of the evils in their view or whatever. But anarchists of the right will compromise with states and politicians and that they think might advance their own interest in some peripheral way. And then you find the same thing as well with anarchists of the left. Noam Chomsky is an example. He is more or less a loyal Democrat when it comes to his views of the state, because he thinks the Republicans are just so awful that defeating them at all costs is necessary. He takes the same position that a lot of liberal ideologues do. He believes in voting for third parties of the left, obviously, like the Greens. He believes in voting for third parties only in so-called safe states where the Democrats are going to win anyway. Like he says that Chomsky says he'll vote for, the Greens in Massachusetts because he knows they're going to go for the Democrats anyway. It doesn't matter. And he, in fact, I even called Noam Chomsky out publicly on that once, because when Ron Paul was running for president the first time back in 2007 and 2008, Chomsky came out and actually said that Hillary Clinton was preferable to Ron Paul. And I thought, well, I think this is kind of a reach here. I can understand, I can understand different anarchists from different types of schools of anarchism supporting politicians and political parties on a pragmatic or strategic grounds. I know anarchists of the left who vote for the Green Party, or even the Democrats. I know some who are going to vote for Bernie Sanders. And I know anarchists of the right who support Ron Paul or Rand Paul or the Libertarian Party, or even at least some Republicans. But and I don't, again, I'm not making a value judgment about that, but when you have a supposed anarchist coming out and saying Hillary Clinton, a career, an arch imperialist warmonger and tool of the banking establishment and career criminal and a probable sociopath by any, from what I can tell, saying that she is somehow Ron Paul is who's basically a pacifist, I almost say that strikes me as a bit of a reach. So I called Chomsky out on that. Actually debated that with him privately, but again, he's somebody that just he has such a severe case of what I call right-wingophobia. He'll even back Hillary over Ron Paul. But again, I mean, is that any worse than Kropotkin supporting World War I? I mean, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the last group that we haven't yet mentioned, kind of the real black sheep of the anarchist movement, are the Anarcho-nationalists, which are, that Troy fella from England?
Troy Southgate, yeah.
Troy Southgate,
I know him well. Yeah, Troy Southgate.
Now, it's funny because in a lot of ways, I think Bakunin was a kind of proto-anarcho-nationalist, because wasn't Bakunin a pan-Slavophile?
He was. Bakunin advocated for Slavic independence against some of the imperialist systems under which the Slavs were dominated by at the time. One thing, though, that's important to remember about Bakunin is that he really didn't become an anarchist until the latter part of his life. I think it was really only like in the last 7 years or so of his life that he was really a hardcore anarchist. I mean, before that, he had been a pan-Slavic nationalist and he'd been a revolutionary socialist. So his thinking on this kind of evolved over time. But it's certainly true that Bakunin was a pan-Slavic nationalist. I don't know of any evidence that he ever renounced that. Proudhon referred to himself as a French patriot. He referred to France as the sacred land of Gaul. Gustav Landauer, he was a well-known German anarchist. He was actually murdered by the Free Corps during the post-World War I period. But he was a German Jewish anarchist, anarcho-communist, who also had this idea of a kind of folkish nationalism, where he differentiated between the folk, the people, the culture, the traditions, and things like that, and the state on the other hand. And in one thing too that needs to be remembered is that a lot of anarchists in the Western world think of anarchism as somehow a uniquely Western ideology. And when they think about anarchist history, they tend to think about Western anarchist movements in Spain and France and places like that, Russia, Germany. But anarchism was a huge movement in China in the early 20th century. In pre-Mao China, there was a very large anarchist movement there, probably about as large as the anarchist movement in the West. And that movement was also very nationalistic. It favored the liberation of China from external imperialist powers, the Japanese, the Europeans, the Russians, whomever. So this is another issue where anarchism has something of a built-in dichotomy between anarcho-nationalists and anarcho-internationalists. On one hand, there are anarchists who who are also anarchists of the left, who also believe in working class struggle, and they sort of follow the Marxist line of workers of the world unite, the workers have no country, and then on a wider sense, anarchists have these slogans like, no states, no masters, no borders, no nations,
No gods.
no gods, no gods. Was it no gods, no masters, no borders, or something like it? Depends. There are variations of this slogan, but.
Yeah.
But the idea, though, is that, well, nations are just artificial constructs. National borders are just lines on a map, usually created by military conquest. Who cares about those? What's so important about them? Why should I have anything against somebody because they were born in a different place or something like that? And this is one of the arguments that many anarchists use for total open borders immigration as well. On the other hand, you do have anarcho-nationalists, national anarchists, and others who say, well, not so fast. There's a difference between the state on one hand and an ethnic group or a cultural group or a national group on the others. They'll say, for example, the French are not just the French because of their state or because of lines on a map. There's a language, there's a culture, there's a history, there's a tradition, and all of that. So what they say, can't that exist independently of the state? Couldn't you have the French identity, for example, independently of the state? So you do have these anarcho-nationalists or national anarchists or tribal anarchists, and there are different variations of this view as well, who have this kind of orientation towards some kind of cultural particularism. And then, of course, that puts them in conflict with the anarchists who say, I'm a citizen of the world. The world is my country. That kind of universalist, Enlightenment philosophy, or like I said, the quasi-Marxist view. It's all just about the workers of the world unite. And there have been plenty of conflicts in anarchist circles over these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I've noticed that anarcho-capitalists, anarcho-leftists, communists, syndicalists, the whole 9 yards, and anarcho-nationalists have all tried to claim Iceland during the Viking era as a anarchist, their version of anarchism.
Well, now, the anarcho-capitalists as well, the national anarchists, the anarcho-capitalists, and the anarcho-communists have all claimed Iceland as for themselves.
I would argue that in some sense, it's a deeply anachronistic exercise. But on the other hand, I think the anarcho-nationalists probably have the best case in that race.
Yeah. The the system that all of these different types of anarchists claim aberration for, the old Icelandic system, was certainly a folkish, traditional type of society. We're talking about something that's almost pre-feudal here. We're not really talking about anything that can even really be understood in terms of modern political ideologies and philosophies and things like that. But it was certainly a society that was guided by things like culture and custom and tradition and folk beliefs and probably religion and things like that. It wasn't it certainly wasn't something that was committed to universal equality. It wasn't any
or capitalism.
They wouldn't have had any clue as to what any of that was. So yeah, I suppose looking at it in that light, you could argue they were a type of anarcho-nationalism. But there are among some of these neo-pagan groups or radical traditionalist groups, there's actually overlap of some of that with types of anarchism or anarcho-nationalism. There are national anarchists and anarcho-nationalists who are interested in that as well. And that's kind of how they look at it, that this kind of folkish, customary type of traditionalist, almost mystical, blood and soil type of culture is a type of anarchism. It's not really a state. It really predates the state or modern states or modern societies or capitalism or socialism or Marxism or any of that.
Yeah. Well, we're nearing the end of the hour, so I think we'll end part 1 of our discussion with anarchism with Keith Preston. So why don't you just give your final words as we round up part 1 of this session?
Well, like I said, if listeners want to know more about anarchism. The book that I would recommend is Demanding the Impossible by Peter Marshall. Demanding the Impossible by Peter Marshall. It's a long book. It's an 800-page book, but it gives a very comprehensive overview of anarchist history, and it's available for free online. You can actually download PDF copies online. It's the book Noam Chomsky actually says he likes to recommend on anarchism. He thinks it's really the standard when it comes to describing anarchist history. And it doesn't just deal with anarchism in the 19th and 20th century. It goes all the way back and talks about prototypes from Greece and ancient China and the Middle Ages and all of that. And it's not a sectarian left or right anarchist. It's definitely within the left tradition, but it also gives a hat tip to anarcho-capitalists and libertarians and some of that as well. And it covers modern types of anarchism, the kind of pink and green anarchism as opposed to the black and red anarchism. So it's a very good historical overview. And of course, you can always go to our website, attackthesystem.com. Attackthesystem.com. We have a lot of material on that related to anarchism and related topics, and as well as other things as well. So definitely check that out.
All right, Keith, thanks for coming on. We'll pick up with part 2.